What if I told you that the most famous poem about failure in the English language is secretly a victory story? Percy Shelley's Ozymandias gets taught everywhere as a warning. Pride comes before a fall, empires crumble, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. And sure, that reading works. The King of Kings is reduced to 2 broken legs in an empty desert, but hiding inside those 14 lines is a second character almost everyone skips right over, the sculptor. The nameless artist who carved that shattered face 3,000 years ago. And here's the twist. Everything the king built is gone, but the thing the artist made is still there. Still speaking, still doing its job. The poem isn't just about a king who lost. It's about an artist who quietly, permanently won. First, some quick context, because the poem's origin story is almost too perfect. In late 1817, Shelley and his friend Horace Smith held a friendly competition. Both would write a sonnet about a fallen statue of Ramses II, the Egyptian pharaoh the Greeks called Ozymandias. News of a giant stone fragment heading to the British Museum was in the air, and ruins were suddenly fashionable. Smith wrote his version, Shelley wrote his. Both were published. And notice what happened next, because it's really the poem's whole argument playing out in real time. Smith's sonnet is a footnote today. Shelley's became one of the most quoted poems ever written. 2 artists carved the same subject, and only the better craftsmanship survived. Before we even open the poem's thesis has already come true. So what do we actually see in the desert? A traveler describes 2 vast, trunkless legs of stone, and near them a shattered face half sunk in the sand. On the pedestal, an inscription, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." That line was meant as a threat to rival rulers. Look at my cities, my armies, my monuments, and give up trying to compete. But time has rewritten the sentence into a joke. There are no works left to look at. The despair now points backward, at the king himself. Ramses spent his reign stamping his own name across Egypt, precisely because he feared being forgotten. And the one thing he couldn't do himself, make his memory last, he had to outsource to an artist. Now look at the line most readers slide right past. It's Sculptor Won those passions read. Shelley pauses, mid-ruin, to give the artist credit. The sculptor read the king, studied him, saw through the royal performance to the frown, the wrinkled lip, the sneer of cold command, and then carved the truth into the official portrait. Think about how subversive that is. This was a commissioned propaganda piece. The pharaoh paid for majesty, the sculptor delivered honesty, and did it so subtly the king presumably never noticed. 3,000 years later, we have no idea what Ozymandias wanted us to think of him. We only know what the sculptor thought of him. Arrogant, cold, contemptuous. The subject of the portrait lost control of his own image the moment a perceptive artist picked up a chisel. Then comes Shelley's sneakiest pun, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. In Shelley's era, to mock meant 2 things at once. It meant to imitate. A sculptor mocks up a likeness, copies the king's passions onto stone, but it also meant exactly what it means today, to ridicule. Shelley chose that word deliberately, because the sculptor was doing both simultaneously. Every faithful stroke of the chisel was also a critique. The more accurately he copied the tyrant's sneer, the more thoroughly he exposed it. That's the double edge of portraiture. You cannot pose for an artist without revealing yourself. The heart that fed those passions, the king's heart, is dust. The hand that mocked them left a permanent record. In the transaction between power and art kept the receipts. Here's the detail I find genuinely eerie. Ask yourself, in this poem, what has actually survived? Not the kingdom, not the palaces, the armies, the cities. Around the wreck, the poem says, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Not even most of the statue. What survives is the face, the expression. Shelley says those passions yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The one artifact still functioning after 30 centuries is the sculptor's psychological read of his employer. Stone outlasted flesh, yes, but more precisely, insight outlasted power. The king commissioned the monument to broadcast one message: I am mighty. The sculptor embedded a different message: he was cruel. Guess which transmission is still broadcasting? Ruins always work this way. The pyramids don't tell us pharaohs were divine. They tell us what their builders could do. And the sculptor isn't working alone. Watch how the poem is built. It's a relay race of storytellers. The sculptor carves the truth into stone. A traveler from an antique land sees it and describes it. The poem's speaker hears the traveler and reports it to us. And behind all of them stands Shelley, arranging the whole chain into 14 lines. That's 4 layers of transmission. And every single layer is an act of art: carving, witnessing, retelling, writing. Notice who's missing from the relay. Anyone with power. No soldier carries this message forward. No government. No dynasty. Ozymandias survives at all, only because artists kept handing him to each other, like a story passed around a fire. The king wanted to be remembered on his own terms. Instead, he's remembered entirely on theirs. There's one more layer, and it's the frame around everything, the poem itself. Shelley was making a bet that his 14 lines would outlast the empires of his own day, just as the sculptor's chisel outlasted Ramses. He was right, and faster than he could have guessed. Shelley drowned less than 5 years after writing it. Dead at 29, a controversial radical most of England was happy to forget. The British Empire he lived under, then the most powerful force on earth, has since dissolved. But Ozymandias is recited in classrooms on every continent. The poem performs his own thesis. A young poet with no army and no throne wrote about the durability of art, and the writing itself proved the point. Shelley became his own sculptor, and time, once again, sided with the artist. Step back and the poem reveals an uncomfortable dependency that every tyrant in history has faced. Power cannot record itself. Kings need sculptors, emperors need poets, regimes need painters and architects. Because stone and language are the only vehicles that travel into the future, and that dependency is a vulnerability. The moment power hires art to carry its message, the artist decides what actually gets carried. Rulers across history commissioned their own glory and received, from their most honest artists, something closer to a diagnosis. Shelley, a political radical who loathed the crowned heads of Europe, understood this perfectly. You can censor a living artist. You cannot censor the finished work once it enters time, because time answers to craftsmanship, not to command. Every monument is a message, and the messenger always signs it, sometimes with a sneer. So here's the reading of Ozymandias I'd carve on the pedestal. The inscription says, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." And we do look. Millions of us, every year, in classrooms and anthologies. But the work we're looking at was never the king's. The empire evaporated. The artwork about the empire is doing better than ever. That's the quiet joke at the heart of the poem. Ozymandias got his eternal fame, but only as the subject of someone else's masterpiece, remembered not as the king of kings, but as an artist's case study in arrogance. Kings build with power, and power expires. Artists build with truth, and truth compounds. So look on the sculptor's work, ye mighty, and take notes. Because in the long run, the empire is temporary. The portrait is forever. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this gave you a new way to see the story, subscribe to Between the Chapters. A new literary deep dive lands every week, and I'd love to have you along for the next one.